Okay, so in this segment, we're going to talk about crisis behavior and how leaders react to crisis and what motivates them in crisis. So I think what you can observe in American history is that there have been numerous leaders that have responded in different ways. The first thing to think about when you read American history and you think about crisis behavior is to think about who you are reading about, right? Again, there are many different leaders in the United States. There are governors, right? There are congressional representatives, et cetera. And if you think about something like 9/11, certainly at the local level, leaders made a considerable difference, right? Rudy Giuliani was talked about as being a very strong leader during 9/11. Governor Pataki was also an important actor. But if we think about who most of the attention was drawn to in the aftermath of 9/11, certainly it was George W. Bush, right? And I think that's fairly consistent if you look at American foreign policy. It's true that shocks, crises affect everybody. The Cuban Missile Crisis certainly affected the governor of Florida. But the entity that you typically pay the most attention to in history when you look at crises, and also as crises are unfolding, is the executive, right? Is the president, right? That is the entity, that's the organization that is looked um, to be the entity that's driving the solution to crisis, or at least coordinating the response to crisis. That is typical, right? Again, you can think about the current crisis associated with COVID-19 and think about what entity is believed to be the most responsible for trying to coordinate some response to COVID-19. And I think regardless of the fact that the response has been spread to governors, and governors have played a critical role in the response to COVID-19, I think you could make the case that the entity that most Americans are looking to be the guiding force, be the coordinating force for the crisis is the Trump administration, right? It's the executive. And so when you think about U.S. responses to World War II or U.S. responses to the Korean War, you're looking to the presidency. And what that tells you is that, and I think this is reasonable to say, and I think most historians would corroborate this, when we look at crisis in the United States, the task is moving towards the executive. Solving the problem is moving towards the executive. Proposing solutions, moving towards the executive. It's in a lot of ways designed that way. So if we look at the design of the U.S. national security establishment, if you look at the Constitution, again, Congress has the power to make war, but the coordination of war and the coordination of crises really starts to fall towards the executive branch. That was how it is designed, and I think if we look at history, that seems to be how it's played out. So I think one thing we could do is try to think about, we could look at each individual president over history and think about why he responded the way that he did. I use the term he because they all are male. And how they responded, right? And what was the unique characteristics of each of these individuals that led them to respond the way that they did, right? So one could argue that Nixon had grand visions and was paranoid and had grand strategy, and so he responded the way that he did to Vietnam and to issues associated with detente, and he came up with these big strategies because he was a more complex thinker, compared to Harry Truman, which Harry Truman is really interesting because he lived through extraordinary times, right? They lived through the end of World War II, constructed the post-war order, the Korean War, the start of the Cold War, etc. And then if you read his autobiography, it's really short. It's probably about 100 pages long and really simple, which indicates that Harry Truman was not a very, very complex thinker. That's not to say that he was incapable of being president, or wasn't a good president, or was a bad president, or whatever. I'll leave that for you to judge. But I think empirically, when you look at Harry Truman, he was not a complex thinker. I think that's that's fair to say. And you can compare him to Nixon, who looked like he was much more complex a thinker, and compare him to perhaps Reagan, who didn't also seem as very complex a thinker. All right, so we can see that these individuals are very different. There's a lot of heterogeneity between these two, or between these different leaders. I realize I've used that term many times this morning, so I apologize. There's a lot of variation between these different leaders. So how do we understand them, right? Do we adopt an approach where we try to understand the intricacies of each president and their personality quirks? That may be useful, and I think there's a lot of value to that. I think one of the problems with that is that if we do it that way, we can't understand the next president until we know them. And then in a sense, we don't get to know them for another set of years, right? It's one thing to be a senator, right? We can identify a president who's been a senator, but we don't know how they're going to behave once they're in the presidency. So we have no way of predicting how they're going to behave. And we have no way of having a general explanation for how presidents tend to behave over time. And we do want that generalizability, right? We do want to be able to forecast when the next crisis comes, what can we expect from our president? Should we expect presidents to behave badly? Should we expect presidents to behave well? Because if we expect they're going to behave badly, maybe we should design some solutions to make sure that they don't, right? So we want to be able to develop a generalized theory of how executives behave, regardless of who's actually occupying that seat. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how should we expect leaders and presidents to behave during times of crises? And what should we expect in particular from American presidents that are in this position? Interestingly, the argument I'm going to make to you is that American presidents are driven by typically one thing. Again, if we generalize, which means that we try to understand all these presidents across time, it's true that each individual president is driven by a lot of different things. But if we try to generalize to understand the behavior of presidents across time and space, the one thing they all have in common is that they want to stay president. Presidents are driven by re-election, right? Now, that might sound cynical, and that might sound like that's conniving and all that, and certainly the reading that you'll have for today about Richard Nixon during Vietnam might corroborate that. But one thing that's interesting is that empirically, if presidents are really interested in staying in their job, regardless if they're really idealistic or if they're really predatory, they have to perform well, right? They have to do a good job. If it's true that the United States has this mechanism where it can kick presidents out of office if they don't respond well, if publics can revolt against them, they have to somewhat serve that public, right? What that suggests is that even if presidents are selfish, conniving, and only interested in re-election, or if they're benevolent and only interested in re-election, they have an incentive to serve the public well in order to stay there. And so what that weirdly suggests is that the selfishness of presidents may well be an asset for the publics they serve. So that's the case I'll make to you today, that even if we have presidents that are motivated by re-election tendencies and the desire for re-election, that actually ends up being a good thing for the public. And that's something that's, I can demonstrate the logic of that to you, and I think that that is correct. But I do want you to think about what the other implications of that are, that if you have presidents that are solely driven by the need to be there, what does that mean for candidates, right? What does that mean for how Richard Nixon behaved during the 1968 election? So I'll leave that to you. Let's go ahead and get started with the lecture portion. If I can pull up my screen. Okay, I'm sorry, this always takes a long time. Okay, so what we want to talk about again today is crisis decision making. On a daily basis, as we talked about last time, Congress and bureaucracies are basically dealing with foreign policy. Congress is appropriating money. Bureaucracies are doing the day-to-day work, right? They do the passports, they do the coordination of trade, they do settlement of trades in banking systems, they do exercises with other militaries, right? And they do diplomacy, right? So on a daily basis, Congress and the bureaucracies are dealing with things. And that's normal, right? That basically creates a situation of normalcy between states. And most of the time, foreign policy is fairly routine, right? There's not a lot disrupting it. It's sort of day-to-day operations, not much changes. But when something does change, when crises do happen, when we see 9/11, when we see Pearl Harbor, when we see the outbreak of COVID, whatever it may be, the president is really identified as the primary decision maker, right? They are the executive in the US system. So he or she, whoever the president is, becomes that primary decision maker. So first thing we want to do is define what exactly we mean by crisis. It's a disruption in the normal relations between a pair or a set of countries, right? So something is different, right? Something has changed. There's been a shock. There's a terrorist attack, right? There's an act of aggression, right? There's an earthquake, right? There's a financial crisis, whatever it may be. Something has happened that disrupts the normal course of events, right? The normal things that happen that bureaucrats solve and that Congress solves, that's been disrupted. So now something has to change. and the president has to use the assets at their disposal to try to respond to this particular crisis. So let's think about some examples of crisis throughout history. One we have, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think is the most significant crisis that the U.S. has ever, or one of the most significant crises the U.S. has ever faced, given that if that had gone wrong, none of us would be here. We have Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in the early 1990s. The September 11th attack is also a key example of a crisis. And the COVID outbreak is also an example of a crisis. And again, to emphasize this, responding to crises is actually a difficult job. I've said this before, but I do want to emphasize it again. In retrospect, it's easy to look at behaviors of politicians and say, well, they should have done a better job in crises. They should have just known things, right? They should have been aware of things. But in the time of the crisis, oftentimes you are dealing with an environment of uncertainty. You don't know things. You learn things after the fact, right? Had you known those things during the time of crisis, it might have changed your behavior, but you often don't have all the information at your disposal, and you're under time pressure, right? So it is difficult to make decisions in crisis. For most of you, if you have to make decisions very, very quickly, or if you have to make decisions under time pressure, I think if you look at your life retrospectively, you kind of identify, well, I wish I had done better there. I probably could have made a better decision there. I probably could have done better with more time, however you may think about it. So imagine you're in a position of a president or a presidential advisor, and not only are you making a decision for yourself, you're making a decision that affects hundreds of millions of people, not just in the United States, but also outside the United States. That's difficult. It's difficult to come to a decision. It's difficult to make these decisions. And so it is a tough job, right? Now, having said that, it's the job all of them signed up for, so they have to deal with it. But I do want to emphasize again that it is a tough job. Given these incredible difficulties and given the stakes and given the time pressure, I think one thing we can think about is what's motivating these leaders. What are they trying to do, right? What's keeping them, what's in sense influencing their decision making? Again, one strategy is to basically look at the history of each of these leaders, right? To look at their attributes. That's one way of doing this. The other way of doing this is to try to see what links them together. What commonalities do leaders have across time and space, and to try to build a general simplified model so we can understand those types of behaviors. Right, so let's think about leaders in crisis. Again, we know, if we just from examining psychological studies, that presidents and leaders just generally are really diverse. The one thing that links them is that they want to stay there. The one thing that links them is that the primary motivation of these leaders is retention. Think about a wide variety of leaders that you've known or that you've lived through in your lifetime. Perhaps you've had George W. Bush, I'm not sure. Perhaps you've had Barack Obama, right? Which I think all of you have lived through Barack Obama, so that's one. And you've had President Trump. They're very, very different people. There's no question. They're very, very different people. They're from very different backgrounds. But what do they all have in common? They all wanted that second term. That's what they all have in common. They all want to stay there. They all want to retain, since regardless of what you think about them, they can't accomplish the good things or the bad things unless they stay in office. So if we assume that the primary motivation of these leaders is retention, we can kind of understand them a lot better, right? And we can understand leaders not just in the United States, but leaders generally. What leaders want, regardless of who they are, regardless of their intentions, regardless of their personality, their upbringing, their values, etc., what they want to do is to stay in office, because retention can bring policy benefits, right? They might want to enact policies that are sweeping. Retention can allow them to do that. They might want to steal all of the country's wealth. Can't do that unless you're in office, right? So regardless of what they want, they have to stay in office. Now, in the United States, you're term limited out, right? You can only win one re-election and then you're term limited out. But even so, I think you can make the case that most leaders have some interest in ensuring that the next president that comes in line is from their party, if for no other reason to protect their legacy, right? I think you can make the case that Barack Obama strongly preferred Hillary Clinton to follow him versus Donald Trump, but for anything to protect his legacy, right? To protect some of his key policy accomplishments. Right. And so I think the same thing could be said perhaps with George W. Bush, where the preference would be for John McCain over Barack Obama to protect his legacy, right? Barack Obama was going to be a repudiation of the Bush legacy, where McCain was going to be something that might allow the Bush legacy in retrospect to be rehabilitated, just given where it was in 2008. So there is an incentive on the part of presidents, even if they're being term limited now, to try to make sure that their successor is someone that is more consistent with their ideas, is more consistent with their political viewpoint. So regardless, there is an incentive of presidents in their first term and their second term to try to make sure that either they win re-election or that their successor falls along with their political preferences. So how do you do this? Well, to stay in power, leaders have to satisfy 51% of what Bruce Benedum-Mesquita and his colleagues call the selectorate. The selectorate is simply the group of people that choose who the next leader is going to be. So in the United States, it's the group of registered voters, right? Those are the groups that are going to choose who the next president is going to be. You actually, in the US system, should break it down more by the states, because the states make these choices, but generally, right, it's the group of registered voters that are going to be the ones that choose what the next leader of the United States. So it's the voting public. But in some systems, like dictatorships, it might be a junta, right? Or it might be a party, right? It might be a group of people or a select group of people that basically make all the decisions. The selectorate is the group of people that actually choose the leader. In the United States, it's going to be the group of registered voters. Now, according to Benedum-Mesquita et al.'s theory, leaders have two ways of trying to get this coalition to vote for them. If the coalition is very small, so if it's a junta, if it's a political party, or if it's just a group of military officers, one way to do this is to try to provide these individuals with what are called private goods, right? Build them a palace, provide them with the weapon systems that they want, right? Provide them with tax cuts, provide them with direct cash transfers, whatever it is, you can pay off these individuals so you get their votes and they allow you to stay in power. Hereditary monarchies do this a lot. They build palaces. Saddam Hussein would build his coalition supporters palaces, right? That's one way you can do that. But as the selectorate grows, right? So for example, if you move from a junta or you move from a hereditary family to the group of registered voters in the United States, you can't build everybody a palace, right? There's not enough resources to build every one of your voters a palace. There's not enough resources to provide every one of your followers with a direct cash transfer, right? That typically is not done, right? We've seen that as COVID, but that typically is not done, right? You typically don't provide all of your individual followers with some private benefit, right? And even if you could, right? Even if you could do something like with COVID and provide a direct cash transfer to all of all the members of the selectorate, it typically is not enough to really influence their votes, right? It's typically not enough to really make them say, oh, I got this direct cash transfer, I should continue voting for this incumbent. What that means is that if leaders are dealing with a small selectorate, it's easy to use private goods to try to ensure your support. But private goods are not going to work as the selectorate gets progressively larger. As the selectorate gets progressively larger, leaders are going to have to rely on providing their publics, their selectorate, with better policies. Policies are more efficient, right? If you provide, for example, good road systems, that's going to be a much more efficient way of trying to get your voters to stay with you versus providing them with direct cash transfers. Maybe some voters would still be motivated by cash transfers, but what if we move to defense, right? What if you promised your selectorate that you could provide them with better protection? That's going to be more influential than a cash transfer. So you could provide effective public policy, better defense, better roads, etc. Those public policies are going to be more effective at reaching a larger group of people than the private transfers. What this tells you, again, if you take this logic, is that to stay in power in a country or in a state where you have a small selectorate, you use private goods. In a larger group of people, like registered voters in the United States, you have to start trending towards public policy, which is better policy, right? You have to serve your public with better policy. So in the United States, the group that you have to satisfy are the 270 electors, which come from individual votes within these states, right? That's a large group of people. right? That's an enormous sense. If we look about the states that are really important in this election, we have Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, we have Virginia, North Carolina certainly in there, Florida certainly in there, Arizona certainly in there. That's a lot of people, right? And it's a diverse group of people. The interests of those individuals voting in Arizona might be quite different from the interests of those individuals voting in Wisconsin. There's some similarities, but they are different, and they're different from between Florida as well. So what you can't do is necessarily provide cash transfers to all these individuals, or if you build a military base, it's not going to benefit everybody. The best strategy you can do is to try to target some aid towards these different swing states, but to also try to provide just generally good public policy. Good public policy will benefit people in Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, etc. That's one efficient way that leaders can stay in power, right? Again, you wouldn't want to just target swing states either, right? Because the effectiveness of these swing states is going to be dependent on the performance of non-swing states. Like, so for example, if we look at the per capita balance of payments between the federal government and the states, what we can see is that the federal government has deficits between itself and several of these states. So example, the federal government takes more from New York, takes more from California, takes more from Texas than it gives back, right? Again, that's just based on the data. In order to get the resources it needs to provide assistance to the swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, etc., it's going to need good performance from these key states. So New York has to perform well economically for the federal government to have resources to give to Michigan, to give to Pennsylvania, to give to Wisconsin, to give to Florida, to give to Arizona. Those states have to do well, right? So in a sense, leaders that are serving large constituencies, leaders like US presidents, for example, too, have to perform well, right? They have to be able to do a good job of managing their state so they can at least get the money from these key population centers to transfer to the rest of the state. So they can't just focus on swing states. Take a step back. For them to get resources to give to swing states, the other population centers have to perform well too. So what do Democratic leaders use? Democratic leaders, not meaning the political party, but those leaders that are operating in democracies. 51% of the voting public is a great deal of people, but that's who they have to satisfy, 51% of the registered voters, in order to stay in power. There's not enough resources to buy all these individuals off. So Democratic leaders therefore have incentives to provide good public policy. If Democratic leaders provide good public policy, New York will do well, California will do well, Texas will do well, Illinois will do well. There'll be more resources. Those resources can then be distributed to key swing states or non-swing states even, like distributing resources to West Virginia might be important, or Missouri, et cetera, right? So you have to perform well in good public policy. Now imagine the president was not representing this large group of people. Suppose the president was decided by only voters in New Jersey, as an example. We see New Jersey has a deficit with the United States, or the United States has a deficit with New Jersey. Well, if I'm only serving voters in New Jersey, I will take resources from every other state and just start pushing them into New Jersey, right? And I'll give New Jersey a big surplus with the United States, right? I'll start giving New Jersey more and more resources. There'll be no incentive for me to serve the entire public, right? I can get enough resources just by taxing the United States, regardless of how they perform, to satisfy my small constituency in Jersey, right? So because the United States is this larger group of people that are serving it, right? It's not just New Jersey, not just a smaller group of constituents. We have to produce good public policy, right? Presidents have to produce good public policy in order to support their key constituents. Now, this includes foreign policy. And the good thing for leaders in democracies and US presidents is that foreign policy is their realm. They can take credit for successes. Challengers can't do that, right? If an incumbent leader succeeds in foreign policy, that is their success, right? And they are the ones that can say, we provided this good public policy to you, we're benefiting all of you, give us the reward for it. And most of the time, they're going to be rewarded for it. And that cuts across parties, right? So in George W. Bush's initial response to 9/11, in a bipartisan way, George Bush was rewarded. George Bush at one point had close to 90% approval ratings, which never happens anymore, right? So in terms of foreign policy successes will be celebrated by everybody. when President Obama killed Osama bin Laden, that was looked at as a foreign policy success. Everyone thought that was a good thing, right? In the United States, everyone was willing to reward him for that success. Now, that's a challenge for those that are trying to replace the incumbent. What challengers have to do is to somehow break the Democratic leader's hold on 51% of the coalition. So in this current election, we saw a wide variety of challengers in the Democratic primary. What they have to do is to appeal to people in that coalition to defect. What each of these leaders did was try to appeal to President Trump's supporters and to try to convince them to defect from his coalition. The way you can do that is to say that you'll do things better. If you argue that President Trump's Iran policy is really bad, they have to promise something better. If they want to argue that President Trump's abandonment of the TPP was a bad choice, they have to promise something better. If they want to make the case that President Trump's treatment of NATO leaders is a bad thing, they have to promise to do something better, right? And they also have to make some predictions. They have to say, if you continue to go down the course that President Trump has said, things will get worse and worse and worse. But here's the issue. All of those are speculative. All of those are promises. Individuals, voters, don't know if these leaders will do any better, right? They can identify if they agree that the incumbent's doing a bad job, but they don't know if any of these leaders will do any better, and they don't know if things would get better on their watch, right? So that is a challenge in foreign policy, at least. The president is something that's secure. The president is something that you know. The president has a record. Challengers are speculating, right? They're saying, if we were in office, we would do this. But a president can tell you, I have done this, right? So that's a key difference in evaluating challengers versus an incumbent. And what that does is produce an advantage in incumbency. Again, what we know from American politics is about 85% of incumbents are reelected. That's a huge advantage, right? So the leader has an incumbency advantage. Also, in terms of foreign policy, the leader has a record. The leader can start to deliver tangible goods right away. The leader has the power of the person there. The leader can start to respond right away. Just as an example of this, in 2012, in the election of 2012, one of the things that the Romney campaign identified from the Obama campaign is that almost every month or every week, the Obama administration would roll out some policy, right? And so if Romney was trying to argue that he would be a better candidate in trying to deal with undocumented immigrants living in the United States, the Obama administration would roll out DACA, right? Just roll out something that would basically take the agenda away from the Romney campaign. So this is a problem that you run if you're trying to challenge the incumbent. The incumbent can enact policy right away, and the incumbent has a record, and the incumbent has a group of people that have put them there already, right? They've already acquired that 51% of the voting public that got them there in the first place. So the incumbent has an incredible advantage in trying to retain office versus those that are on the outside. So let's think about how international crises might affect that. Incumbents at a baseline have a strong chance of being retained, have a strong chance of being reelected. But if there's an international crisis, that could disrupt all of this. So let's think about President Trump today. President Trump, several months ago, looked like he could make a pretty strong case for reelection. Again, regardless of what you think of him, a lot of things were on his side. First of all, he was an incumbent. Second of all, the economy was doing quite well, right? So third, he had won already, right? So there was already a coalition in place that had gotten him into power. So for all of those reasons, his sort of march towards reelection looked pretty good. Not to mention, the statistics were on his side. But now we have an international crisis, right? Now we have COVID, right? And before that, we had Iran. And before that, we had wildfires in Australia. Now, those international crises may well derail all of this, right? The administration's response to COVID might disrupt the ability of Trump to achieve reelection. Take COVID away, right? Take the Iran crisis away. Take away the Australian wildfires and all that stuff. President Trump looked like he was more likely to achieve reelection. Put in those international crises, suddenly that chance of reelection has now been harmed, right? So that's something that international crisis can do, right? That disruption might change the ability of incumbents to achieve power, to remain in power, which is something that they want. Now, if we take a step back and think about this more generally, let's think about wars. wars might be something that are popular, but if wars drag on, right, if wars become more difficult, if wars become more costly, the ability of a president to stay in power might be harmed, right? So again, think about where George W. Bush was when Iraq fell, right, in 2003. Sky high approval ratings. But by the time the election of 2004 came around, his approval rating was going down and trending down because violence in Iraq was going up. So suddenly, the international crisis was disrupting his ability to stay in power. He ultimately won that election, but certainly lost the election of 2006 when he lost congressional majorities. And by the time 2008 came around, John McCain was trounced in the Electoral College by Barack Obama. So these types of things, these international crises can really disrupt what a president wants, which is the ability to retain power or at least have a successor that's going to maintain their legacy. So the challenger is typically going to use the crisis to attack the leader's competency. It's pretty easy to look at the Biden campaign and see that they're using the COVID crisis to try to attack the competency of the Trump administration. Now, again, you can make your own judgments as to whether or not you think that's fair or not, but it's pretty clear that what challengers will do, given their disadvantages, is try to use performance in foreign policy and performance in international crisis as a way to try to attack the leader. If a leader is performing poorly in the crisis, the challenger's attacks will appear correct. I remember in 2012, right, the Romney campaign talked about the great unraveling of the Obama foreign policy, right, which was referring to the events in Benghazi and the rise of the Arab Spring. These were intended to try to make the Obama administration look like it was incompetent in foreign policy. If that's the case, right, if these attacks can harm foreign policy, what an incumbent has to do is to perform really well in the international arena, or these attacks are going to look legitimate, right? These attacks are going to look like they're real. These attacks are going to look like they're right? So take, for example, go back to the Obama administration in 2012. The previous year, Obama had killed Osama bin Laden. So every time he was attacked and every time the Romney campaign said that your foreign policy is unraveling, Obama could simply say, I killed bin Laden. End of discussion, right? That kind of had a way of just taking the air out of the balloon there. But go a bit ahead. In 2014, ISIS arises, right? We have a Libyan fiasco. And so in 2016, when Trump attacks the Obama foreign policy as being a disaster, you can see it. Right, there's some evidence that might seem to support that conclusion. I wouldn't say that Obama's foreign policy changed all that much, but if we look at the evaluation of that foreign policy from that point, it looked like Obama was a lot better at handling things in 2012 than it did in 2016. Point being, there's an incentive on the part of leaders to start doing well in these international crises to try to blunt some of these attacks that are coming from their challengers. So if we think about it that way, competition may be a good thing. It might be unfair, right? Some of these attacks that go on against incumbents might be looked at as unfair, but what it does do is force incumbents to actually perform. It forces incumbents to actually try to, in a sense, serve their public to the best extent possible. If their record on foreign policy is going to look bad and that's going to harm their chances of being reelected, they have to make their record on foreign policy look good. And if they can only make their record on foreign policy look good by trying to serve that large group of people that are the registered voters in the United States, they're going to be trying to pursue policies that benefit a significant number of people. And in times of crisis, they're going to try to make sure that they don't look incompetent. They're going to devote the maximum level of resources they can to succeeding in crisis. So what we might expect empirically is that due to these electoral pressures and due to this political competition, democracies are actually going to perform quite well in crisis. Now think about that statement. That's interesting because if you go back to the beginning of the course, you remember there were critiques about allowing individuals to have too much influence over foreign policy and that was a bad thing. That was a critique of the US system. But if we follow the logic of this argument, having people have critiques of the US system, having people involved in the US system forces presidents to actually do a good job. Nothing else would, right? If that competition wasn't there, a president could do whatever they want. They could argue away their failures or just ignore them completely. But because they are judged on their performance in foreign policy, and more importantly, I think because foreign policy and the outcomes of foreign policy can be public events, right? You can observe whether or not wars go well. You can observe whether or not wars go bad. There is a strong incentive on the part of democratic leaders to try to perform well, and that includes U.S. presidents. So contrary to this idea that democracy decreases foreign policy performance, the selfishness of the leaders, the need for these leaders to achieve re-election, that's going to motivate them to do better in foreign policy. At least that's the argument of Bruce Wayne and Mesquita and his colleagues. Now, let's look at some evidence to evaluate this argument. From 1816 to 2008, what we can see is that democracies clearly seem to be performing better than your average state, or than certainly autocracies, when we look at war fighting. According to studies by Lake in 1992 and Dobransky in 2014, democracies are winning about 84% of their wars. Now, what's interesting is that the US and France account for 16 out of 31 of these wars and win 15 of them. So the US and France are pretty effective in winning their wars, but they're accounting for the bulk of these wars. What we can also see is that democracies emerge victorious in nearly almost every protracted rivalry they've experienced. And they also tend to succeed in economic disputes and sanction disputes in particular, right? That's one I know because I've worked on the data there. Point being, if we look at these data, it looks like democracies are doing better in war fighting. It looks like democracies are doing better in protracted rivalries. And it looks like democracies are doing better in trade disputes, right? And in disputes over economic sanctions. Democracies are doing better, right? One explanation for that is that they're forced to do better. Leaders in democracies have to care. They have to exert the maximum amount of effort they can to try to make this work and to try to succeed in foreign policy. And I think this statistic that the bulk of these are the US, that actually confirms it for the American case, or that's more evidence in favor of it for the American case. Now, let's think about how strong this incentive is. This might all sound well and good, but if you recall, most of the time, voters don't care about foreign policy. They're not paying attention. They're not all that interested. It seems far off, right? It's not something that's going to influence them all that much. And if it doesn't influence them all that much, one question might be, well, if that's true, how pressured would democratic leaders be to perform in foreign policy crises? How much should a president care? Can a president just argue away bad foreign policy? Is it really going to affect them? What I think we can see from the evidence is that that depends on the size of the crisis. If a crisis is pretty small, a leader can try to rely on their reputation or rely on their performance in the domestic arena, or try to basically argue it away to try to maintain their coalition, right? So most individuals that supported Barack Obama didn't change their view of him simply because of the Libyan civil war. That was evidence that the Obama foreign policy wasn't going so well there, and even by his own admission, that was a difficult foreign policy exercise. The same could be said of the Syrian civil war, but most voters weren't going to care about that because it didn't seem to affect them directly. But if these crises get very, very large, if they get very highly profile, since they're high-profile events. So, for example, if ISIS spreads into Iraq after Obama said that the Iraq war is over, then they're going to care, right? And what we can see is that oppositions will try to make even minor crises appear like major ones. If you've heard this term, Benghazi, 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 right? There was an effort to try to make the events at Benghazi seem like they were an enormous foreign policy failure because the opposition had an incentive to try to magnify some of the failures of the Obama administration and downplay some of the successes. And the same would be true of Democrats looking at the Trump administration. Most of you, or most Americans, might not have heard of Venezuela all that much and might not be paying attention to events in Venezuela. But if you have been paying attention to events in Venezuela, what you'll notice is that the Trump administration has been interested in deposing Maduro and has failed to do so. And that's something that the Democrats will pounce on, that they will say, look, Trump is behaving in an irresponsible way. He's encouraging for the overthrow of Maduro. And even if he's encouraging the overthrow of Maduro, he's failing to do it, right? So he's incompetent all around, right? Those are all ways you can make minor crises even seem like big major ones, which are efforts to try to make the incumbents seem like they're just incompetent and they cannot be trusted with foreign policy. Now, in major crises, democratic leaders can't minimize what occurs. You can't hide that. So if violence in Iraq continues to spike, and George Bush said that he could handle Iraq, right, and that US troops would be coming home from Iraq, you can't hide that, or you simply can't hide that. And your failure can't be offset by private goods or reputation or other factors. And the opposition will magnify any failure, right? So the flip side of this is that if democratic leaders can avoid entering into crises that look like they're going to be difficult and can avoid entering into crises that look like they can't win, they're going to restrain their foreign policy. So leaders are going to enter into crises they think they can win and try to avoid entering into crises that they don't have a high probability of winning. Here's an example of that. In 2014, Russia started to engage in what I think can be characterized as territorial aggression in Ukraine. If there's territorial aggression, that's something that could be opposed militarily. Was the United States willing to oppose Russian behavior in Ukraine militarily? Absolutely not. And the reason for that is that's not a crisis that the U.S. is likely to win, right? If the U.S. were to deploy American forces to fight the Russians in Ukraine, would they likely come out on top? Well, maybe they would, but could they sustain that, right? Would the United States be willing to sustain a major military operation in Ukraine, which is not a NATO ally, to fight the Russians, right? Or would the Russians be much more committed to trying to seize control of their territories in Ukraine and in Crimea? Given that, the Obama administration decided not to engage, right? It condemned the Russians for what they were doing and imposed sanctions, but it didn't deploy American forces to try to oppose what the Russians were doing because it probably understood that if it did that, it would likely fail. All right, so that's a strategic use of force. What that means is that democratic leaders tend to enter into crises they think they're going to win and they think they're going to prevail in, but they try to stay out of crises they don't think they're going to win in because they don't want to look bad, right? And they don't want to be condemned as a failure. Now, you can contrast that with dictatorships. Dictatorships have winning coalitions that are quite small, right? Often less than 51% of the voting public. And if dictators fail, what they can do is offset foreign policy failures with private goods, right? So dictators can afford to take more risk in foreign policy, right? So Saddam Hussein could afford to allow a war to emerge between himself and the United States, knowing that the US was likely going to win, knowing that the US was more powerful, because what he knew is that if he lost the war, he could buy off key members of the Ba'athist Party with cash and with palaces. He could survive losing a war. Dictators can survive losing wars, right? Sometimes they don't, but oftentimes they have more tools at their disposal to try to buy off their key supporters so they can survive losing wars. Whereas a democratic leader, that becomes harder. Right? Saddam lost his war in the first Gulf War and he got more powerful. Lyndon Johnson lost his war in Vietnam, or looked like he was losing his war in Vietnam, and he lost his presidency, right? When the Tet Offensive happened in 1968, and Walter Cronkite, who was looked at as the voice of reason and the voice of trust within the media, said that the war looked like it couldn't be won, then Lyndon Johnson effectively had lost his foreign policy, had portrayed himself as a foreign policy failure and lost his domestic agenda. Lyndon Johnson had a very ambitious domestic agenda, but after Vietnam started to go badly, that agenda was stalled. Now contrast Lyndon Johnson with Saddam Hussein. Both lost their war. Saddam loses his war, gets more powerful. Lyndon Johnson loses his war, loses his presidency. You can see that there's a clear difference, right? The democratic leader has to actually worry about satisfying their constituents, where Saddam Hussein did not have to do so. So what we see there, if we look at the United States, is that the United States tends to be very selective, it tends to be very successful for a couple of reasons. One, it has enormous capability, right? Given that enormous capability, leaders tend to enter into crises they think they're going to win. And most of the time, they'll exert the maximum effort to win because they don't want to be condemned as a failure by their opposition, right? They're also going to avoid entering into crises that they think they'll lose or that think will go poorly, right? So we have a strategic mechanism where the U.S. picks cases that it thinks it's going to win, and in most cases, it is going to win just because it's very, very powerful. So democracies have these institutional incentives to perform well in crises. Now, I think in the American case, much more than other democracies, there's a bit of a danger. The U.S. is incredibly powerful and has enormous military capability. Because of that, the United States might be more willing to initiate wars more often because leaders think they're going to win and they think that's going to be politically popular. And empirically, what we can see is that the US initiates more militarized crises than any other state in the world, and also initiates more trade disputes than any other state in the world. Why is that? It's because the United States probably thinks it's going to win these, and most of the time it does. Now, you can make your own judgments as to whether that's a good or bad thing. I happen to think, as someone that's studying peace, that if it's the case that we want peace, and you have the United States initiating more of these crises because it's politically popular and the US thinks it's going to win, that can be something that is potentially dangerous. I want you to think about that in the discussion part of this course, and think about that in the context of the article we're going to read. But that is potentially dangerous, right? That the US can be almost too successful in foreign policy, which allows it to use its military capabilities a lot more than other states would. So to wrap up this, what we're talking about today is how, in a sense, how presidents respond in crisis, how they do in crisis. One argument is that they would do poorly because they are constrained by democratic forces. But if we follow the logic of Bruce Banner and Mesquita, what we see is that presidents are likely compelled by their need to stay in power or protect their legacy. And if that's the case, they know that foreign policy is an observable event, and they know that foreign policy failures are going to be magnified by their opposition, even if they're not that big a deal, right? They're going to be magnified by their opposition. Given that, and given their interest in retention or preservation of their legacy, their incentive is going to be to perform better. And their incentive is going to be to use all their capability to perform as well as they possibly can. Their incentive is also going to be to stay out of conflicts they think they're going to lose, right? So what we can see here is that this need to stay in power that presidents may have, that might be interpreted cynically. But if we follow the logic of it, it actually may be producing good policy outcomes, right? It might be producing better foreign policy than we would see if this were a dictatorship. So what we want to think about next time as we move forward, you're going to have your exam on Monday, and we're going to start talking about some of the reasons why we might see organized violence between entities that started to emerge as states. We're going to take a look at that. But then what we want to think about is, imagine that you have these leaders that want to do well in foreign policy, and some leaders that may have less incentive to care, that have smaller electorates. We want to think about how these two types of states, the United States and other states, may strategically interact. US presidents want to retain power. Other leaders want to retain power. If they're in a strategic situation where they're trying to negotiate between war and peace, what does that bargaining look like? And ultimately, does that increase the likelihood of war or decrease the likelihood of war? Hold that thought. Right now, we just want to think about how foreign policy works in the United States. How it works here is that the re-election incentive of presidents force them to try to perform well in foreign policy, force them to try to avoid crises that they don't think they're going to prevail in. But what it also means is that when crises occur, opposition forces are going to magnify successes, or opposition forces are going to try to magnify the failures of incumbents and downplay successes. When something happens like COVID-19, you can bet opposition forces will point to the Trump administration and say that is evidence that they are incompetent foreign policy managers, and they're incompetent policy managers just generally. They're going to use what you're observing and try to magnify that. And I think it's up to voters to try to figure out, are those statements correct or are they not? And so I'll leave that to you to make your judgment. So don't forget to contribute to the discussion forum that was written about the Nixon administration of the Vietnam War. That was, in my view, a really fascinating article. And also remember that your exam is going to be on Monday. The exam will be administered over Sakai. It will be open all day, so you'll just have to take it before sometime before midnight. You'll have 1 hour to do that. And it is open note, open book. So with that, I will stop there. I hope you all have a nice weekend, and I will see you virtually soon.